Alright, welcome. This is the first video of our required foundational documents, Brutus No.1. Alright, so for context, what the AP test is looking for is this. It's about liberty and order. It says a balance between governmental power and individual rights has been a hallmark of American political development. So that's kind of the mindset or the prism with which we want to be looking through when we observe Brutus No.1. So looking at balancing governmental power with individual rights. All right, so we're going to go through some of the key sections of this paper, and I have basically typed out for you is essentially a little bit of a summary in easy modern English, but we're going to look at especially what's highlighted here. So it goes in order in the paper, just looking at some of the key passages. So this first passage I selected, he's talking about, he says here, when the people once part with power, they can seldom or never resume it again. And then towards the end he says, this is why you have to be careful how you deposit the powers of government. So essentially what he's saying here is that once you give somebody power, in this case government, people who gain a power usually or in fact never actually give that power back. He says, but by force. So you have to take it back from them. So in other words, you need to be really careful of what powers you give a government because they're not going to give those powers back. All right, so now he's going to talk specifically about some of the things within the Constitution that he, as an anti-federalist, finds to be problematic. And so he says, this government is to possess absolute and uncontrollable power. And he goes on to quote from Article 1, Section 8, the Necessary and Proper Clause. And so he quotes that, and then he makes reference to the Supremacy Clause as well. And his idea is that because of these two clauses, necessary and proper and supremacy, that the federal government will have unlimited power because they get to decide what's necessary and what's proper, and they are the supreme law of the land. So his argument is that they will have unlimited power. Whether, obviously we're not saying that he's accurate in all of these claims, but clearly it did greatly expand their power, so he had good reason to be concerned. All right, now in this section, this passage, he's telling us, he's saying all that is reserved for the individual states must very soon be annihilated. So here he's admitting the fact that there are some reserved powers, but he's saying that these are so small, they're so insignificant, and because the federal government has that unlimited power, like we discussed earlier with the supremacy and necessary and proper clause, that these powers aren't long for the world. They will soon be taken away as well. So yes, states have reserved powers, but they're going to get taken away too, is what he claims. And obviously this one is accurate in a lot of ways because we know the federal government now has powers over lots of things that were originally considered reserved powers. All right, so here he's talking about the power of taxation, and here he's clearly worried that this is going to greatly empower the federal government. He says when you give Congress the power to tax, he's like, the idea of confederation is totally lost, which he's definitely right about. But remember, they were getting rid of confederation, creating federal systems, so even his opponents probably wouldn't have disagreed with him there. But now he says that the authority to lay and collect taxes is the most important of any power that can be granted. So in other words, if a government can't tax you, it has no power over you. But once a government can tax you and it can take your money by force, he's saying down at the bottom, the last thing highlighted, it could be the great engine of oppression and tyranny in a bad government. So in other words, the fact that you're letting the federal government tax, it could allow them to become tyrannical. He's not saying that it will necessarily, but we can see his skepticism here and his deep concern that this is setting the federal government up on a track to become tyrannical. All right, so again, another thing that worries him is the fact that the federal government will now be able to raise armies, and as you notice, in peacetime as well, so not just during war, but we can have a standing army in peace. And he says the only thing that this can do is lead to the destruction of liberty. So like I have written there, allowing the federal government to establish standing armies can lead to the destruction of liberty. So that's a pretty straightforward fear that he is mentioning here. Back to the necessary and proper clause again. So this one's so important. He mentioned it at the outset, and he's coming back to it again, Article 1, Section 8. And he says that the powers given by this clause are very general, which is true, and comprehensive, meaning that they can justify the passing of almost any law. So here he does put the word almost. He didn't before, but justify the passing of almost any law. And he says, again, that this power is very comprehensive and definite. So again, the necessary and proper clause, it's going to allow Congress to do basically anything that they want, pass any law. They just have to say it's necessary and proper. Now, we know it's been interpreted in such a way that, remember, it needs to be connected back to their foregoing powers, the ones that are directly stated. So this one, it hasn't allowed them to do anything, but it has greatly expanded their power. All right, so this is a little bit of a complicated passage. He's kind of talking about how this federal system is setting up a natural conflict between states and the federal government. And so he's saying, well, you made the federal government really strong. You've given it the Supremacy Clause. You've allowed it the Necessary and Proper Clause. And so he predicts they're going to use this power on the fourth line to annihilate all the state governments. And then he says if it's possible for them to do it, so if they may do it, it is pretty certain they will. So then he goes on to say that the fact that some powers are reserved to the states, that's going to be a clog upon the wheels of government, meaning it's going to be annoying. It's going to be blocking the federal government from doing what it wants. So the federal government is naturally going to want to remove that obstacle, the states, out of their way. And so he goes on to talk about how anybody that's given some power wants to increase it. So this is a prediction he's making, which obviously hasn't totally come true, but he says states will limit federal power. So as a result, the federal will naturally destroy state power as a result. Now, this is something that is going to be addressed directly in Federalist number 10. One of his problems with having this federal government is he says that the only republics in history that have ever been successful are small. And he was right about that. So he's saying that when their governments got too large, they went from being free and a republic to becoming tyrannical. Obviously, this is, you could probably debate a little bit, but James Madison gives a really good response to this argument in Federalist number 10 that we'll check out. But it's important to remember that this criticism was a good one at the time. So pointing out that usually republics are small, not large. And then this is another thing that James Madison is going to come up against and strongly respond to. Here he's arguing that in a republic, the first sentence, the manners, sentiments, and interests of the people should be similar. And then he goes on to say how the several states are very diverse. And he views this as a bad thing. He's saying that when you have a republic, you want the people within that republic to be very similar to each other. He's again saying that having a Congress from the multiple states is going to be composed of such heterogeneous and discordant principles as would constantly be contending with each other. In other words, they're too different, they're too diverse, they're going to just fight and nothing will be able to get done. So he argues that a republic should be made up of similar people with similar interests, not a diverse population. All right, remember, if this video helped you at all, please subscribe, hit that like button for me. You know I appreciate it. This has been a La Money production.